in a fearsome battle on, under, and over the waters of the North Atlantic. Their task was to keep the sea lanes of supply open to Great Britain and to nourish the front lines of war with food, fuel, building materials, armaments, and Canadian troops who went forth to join the great invasions of Sicily and Normandy and many others. Their task was a daunting one. Voyaging on the North Atlantic was perilous. U-boats, aircraft, and roaming battle squadrons hunted them relentlessly. It was as apparent to Winston Churchill as it was to his enemy that losing this campaign meant losing the war. In time, supremacy in tactics and strategy and Herculean human effort and wartime scale shipbuilding turned the tide. And pushing that tide forth was the Royal Canadian Navy, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and Canada's Merchant Navy. The men and women of this great endeavor played second fiddle to no other force. As we will hear as this service proceeds, the campaign took its toll in lives lost, families broken, and suffering that took decades to heal. And as we look out to sea from this beautiful site at HMCS Sackville, HMCS Summerside, beyond Major's Beach, and to the fog bank in the distance, we remember from the Battle of the Atlantic that from time to time, great struggles wash ashore onto Canada's coasts. It especially washed ashore here in Halifax. In the early days, the loss of the Canadian ship St. Malo flooded the land with grief. With the roll call of the fallen, when the roll call of the fallen was taken, the loss included young men from all over Canada, but mostly from small communities of Nova Scotia, including Bayswater, Craignish, Digby, Granville, Ferry, and LaHave. But they came from Halifax more than most. Names like William Davy, Arthur Knight, Donald MacDonald, and a 17-year-old lad named Frederick Hansen were from Halifax, and they paid the ultimate sacrifice serving their nation. Time and again, the war was fought right here in Canada. Canadian ships Rose Castle and Lord Strathcona were sunk deep in Conception Bay. And deep in the St. Lawrence River, U-boats attacked convoys, ferries, and escort forces. The loss of the Sydney to Port aux Basques ferry, the SS Caribou, with 136 fatalities, including 10 children, brought home the unlimited nature of the conflict. HMCS Charlottetown was lost just off the Gaspé, and Shawinigan sunk near Port aux Basques with the loss of its entire crew. Month after month, year after year, the peril of war ebbed and flowed, and although it decreased in time, it never disappeared. Right to the end, sailing out of Halifax was one of the most dangerous endeavors of the war. And finally, in a most sad note that marked the very end of hostilities, HMCS Esquimalt was sunk on 16 April, somewhere just out there. 44 men succumbed to the freezing ocean. And while all the remaining survivors of Esquimalt have since passed away, there is a man on board Sackville right now named Lou Howard, who was a young, able seaman. He's amongst us today, and he was on the scramble nets on board HMCS Sarnia as she rescued the survivors of Esquimalt. The names of all the deceased, sailors and merchant mariners alike, are engraved on the panels of the memorial behind me. So, for the men and women of the Canadian forces here today, I say to you that we owe a profound debt of gratitude to our veterans. First and foremost, we honor their sacrifice. And we remember the young lives lost and the constant peril of duty on the seas and in the air above it. But we honor them too because they built the traditions and reputation of our Navy and Air Force. Their schoolhouse was the North Atlantic. The discipline they bequeathed to us came of necessity, from staring down a ruthless enemy, never hesitating to sail forth into the uncertainty of another convoy run and into the savage weather of an unforgiving ocean. This is not a history of a distant past. This is the same ocean we sail today, and we should not fool ourselves into thinking that conflict today is more complex or dangerous. Anti-submarine warfare, electronic warfare, communications, command and control, logistics, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, theater coordination, and inter-service cooperation remain the rudiments of our operations today. And keeping the seaways of the world open is as much our job today as it was in the Battle of the Atlantic. So, fellow brothers, sisters of the Canadian Armed Forces, the great lesson we draw from the Battle of the Atlantic is that our veterans mined the depths of human spirit. They pushed the limits of courage, and they summed up a great stamina and successfully fought an unrelenting campaign for 6 years. As we look to our challenges today, as we strive to generate the operational readiness of our ships and our squadrons, as we steam on missions all over the world's oceans, we know from the veterans of the Battle of the Atlantic that we can dig deep and summon a great reserve of capacity, courage, and stamina to face our challenges. We are reassured that this reserve is there. It is in our training, it is in our design, our leadership ethos, our doctrine, and our tactics. It is literally in our DNA. And thanks to the veterans who found it and exploited it during the great campaign of the Battle of the Atlantic. Let us continue now with the ceremony of remembrance.